Hello, and we welcome you to another CTech Tech Talk. My name is Jordan Crenshaw, Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Technology Engagement Center. Our Tech Talk series is a monthly series that brings together the Chamber, the business community, along with innovators in the tech field and tech policymakers. Today, we're joined by Representative Gerry Connolly and Representative Darrell, two distinguished members of Congress who are now leading an IT modernization caucus on Capitol Hill. It's an incredibly important issue with the federal government spending nearly $100 billion a year on IT and cyber-related investment. Only 8% of those funds go toward operations and maintenance of existing IT investments, including legacy systems. As we've seen the cost of legacy systems increase over time, we realize it's critically important that Congress modernize, and we respect and thank the leadership of both Representative Connolly and Representative Issa for launching this new caucus. Representative Connolly serves Virginia's 11th Congressional District. He's a senior member of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform and serves as chairman of the Subcommittee on Government Operations. Representative Issa serves the California 50th Congressional District. He's senior member of the House Judiciary Committee and House Foreign Affairs Committee. And between 2011 and 2015, Representative Issa was chair of the Oversight Reform Committee. Representative Issa, Representative Connolly, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
It's our pleasure.
Well, we really appreciate you beginning this caucus. Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to start the IT Modernization Caucus on the Hill?
Well, I think it was the most logical thing. I took a 2-year hiatus from Congress. When I came back, Gerry and I, Congressman Connolly and I, began talking almost right away about legislation we had done together and the advancements and lack of advancements that we'd seen in that modernization. And it just seemed like we needed to do more. And this is one of several ideas that sprung from those conversations.
Yeah, let me add to that. I mean, Darrell and I co-wrote the architecture, the legislative architecture for how we acquire and deploy technology in the federal government. That's the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act. It's a mouthful, but it really is the guiding document, legislative document for how we approach IT in federal government. And one of the other reasons in terms of building on that, making sure that's implemented, monitoring that we wanted to form the caucus. But the other dynamic here is we have really seen how critical IT can be or not in the pandemic. So we've seen success stories with the deployment of IT, but we've also seen the limitations when you don't invest in IT. There are 50 state unemployment insurance systems, most of which rely on antiquated IT systems, and they have created enormous problems during the pandemic, especially in periods of high unemployment, when Congress changed the terms of unemployment in terms of eligibility, duration, and quality of benefits. And many of these IT systems simply couldn't handle it. Same thing was reflected at IRS with payments to families and with SBA small business loans, given the huge volume that descended upon those organizations at the height of the pandemic. So we've seen how critical IT is, and we've also seen the benefits when you invest and the liabilities when you don't.
Representative Connolly, I think that's a very good point you made about the pandemic. And the pandemic has clearly showed how important it is for government to modernize, be it issues we have in supply chains, federal employees having to work from home, or outages at SBA as businesses were looking to receive aid. And most recently, over the last few weeks, you've been hearing about the FCC having trouble with IT modernization to do broadband mapping. Did the pandemic change either of your views of IT within government? And can you explain why?
Perhaps I'll go first again. One anecdotal example that I think is noteworthy, all of us now have become experts at Zooming. We sort of take it for granted that we can do our job to a certain extent over Zoom with a lot of people. But remote work during the pandemic, and I'll give you an example. For the State Department, they have fallen in the last 2 years, essentially 1 year behind in passport renewals, in visas around the world. Essentially, places that used to get a passport visa in 2 or 3 weeks now can wait 6 months or a year, depending upon the country. And one of the reasons was they weren't set up for remote interviewing. And even though they actually interview behind a glass wall in most cases, they simply were unable to function remotely. And of course, that's a travesty when we're trying to keep an economy going, when we're trying to move people safely in and out of the country. And what we fail to do, the rest of the world fails to do. And so we could go around from department to department and find similar successes and failures. But it's those failures that tell us that whether this pandemic is a one-time event or something like it happens again in the future, we really have to have a plan to effectively work with the public, assuming they have the tools, with the public, with software that allows us to remotely provide services, something that seems simple. We could all envision it, but it didn't happen.
I would certainly echo that, but I would also talk to some successes. So, several of us have been evangelists for telework for a long, long time, especially telework in the public sector, because private sector actually does a pretty good job of telework. Now, if you want a continuity of operations, using IT through telework is absolutely essential. If you don't have a telework program, robust telework program in place, your continuity of operations is threatened. And we were lucky to get a federal agency at 20 or 21% teleworking. That was success. In the pandemic, we had no choice. And we're at 80 to 90% in many federal agencies having to telework. And it worked. By and large, the federal government didn't stop. Federal employment didn't come to an end. The workforce didn't stop contributing. And glitches and all, it proved how robust and viable the deployment of IT can be in guaranteeing continuity of operations. And I think it also kind of broke down the cultural barriers to telework that had hindered further progress because we had no choice anymore. So the cultural barrier that I suspect when you telework, you're really at home washing the dog and watching soap operas and eating bonbon, that I don't have the luxury of believing that anymore. I've got to have people working remotely. And by and large, I think it worked. I also think, though we've all, with Zoom conferencing, for example, we're all so tired of it that we hate to hear there's another one scheduled, but it is an efficiency we achieved. A lot of, communal congregant communication occurred because technology allowed us to do Zooms, webinars, and other kinds of internet digital communication during the pandemic. I know at the sort of height of the pandemic, I don't know about you, Darrell, but I was probably doing 8 or so a day, and it allowed me to stay in touch with my hospitals, my nursing homes, my employment groups, federal employee groups, and a myriad of other people in my district that otherwise I couldn't have reached in a pandemic with lockdown.
Oh, I think, Gerry, you're exactly right. And we use Zoom when we're talking about several different formats. But the fact is that these Zooms have allowed communications to work very effectively where we implemented them. One of the things that the IT Modernization Caucus is going to have to work on is making sure that we have systems that are government-wide predictable so the public knows how to interface with it. We need to also empower, and I mentioned the State Department earlier, you're absolutely right. The Zooms that Gerry and I did over the last 2 years could have been done to do interviews. They simply would have had to make a decision and implement them, but they didn't. And so making sure that the equipment is available and that individuals are able to use it and that the rules of government allow for it to be used is incredibly important. Can you imagine, and I'll just give the example, we just evacuated from Afghanistan. If the Afghanistan embassy hadn't fallen, they were going to take, at the rate they were going, at least 4 years to clear the people who had been working with us over the years. We waived all the rules, we got them in, and now we're going to do the paperwork afterwards. But that shouldn't be necessary. The fact is, you should be able to interview from anywhere in the world if the equipment is in place. We can make sure we have that. We can make sure in developing nations we have kiosk locations where people can go that allows us to reach perhaps to places where we wouldn't safely send embassy personnel. All of these kinds of, and I happen to be on foreign affairs, so a lot of the things I'm thinking about are specific to our global engagement, but we can make the same decisions domestically. One of the things that, as we're talking IT modernization, though, let's remember that we have some legacy systems, and Gerry mentioned this earlier. We have some legacy systems like at the IRS that are just plain not going to be able to do any of these new systems. They require hard coding. They're not user friendly. They might be good at running a large batch of data, but they're not good at being nimble, such as what we've had to deal with in the pandemic. So as we look at this $100 billion of investment every year, we've got to start going from the tail that we keep paying for to the tooth that's able to really give the kind of service to the American people that they deserve for their large investment in IT.
And I think we could add to that, Darrell, too, the cyber concern. Many of these older legacy systems simply can't, they don't lend themselves to contemporary encryption. And so they are especially vulnerable to hacking attempts. The only exception to that, I'm told, is Chinese don't know yet how to deal with COBOL.
I do. I'm showing my age, but you're exactly right that the only protection on some of the old systems is they're not online and they have antiquated software packages, but that's not the kind of protection you want to rely on.
That's right. And of course, as I think, Jason, you mentioned at the very beginning of this, I mean, the opportunity cost of having to maintain legacy systems is enormous. So the federal government spends roughly $96 billion a year in IT, huge percentage of that simply maintaining older, clunky legacy systems, rather than making investments in innovative technology that can kind of help us leapfrog into the next part of the 21st century.
Yeah, I think you all have made a very good argument that being so out of date is not the right way to go about securing your systems like COBOL is right now. So excellent points there. And both of you are fierce advocates for the need to modernize government IT. Can you explain what some of the most significant barriers are to facilitating the necessary modernization that's out there? What is stopping us from getting from 1950s Eisenhower technology to the 21st century digital economy in a lot of ways?
Well, maybe I could start, Darrell, because some of this is work that Darrell and I did together on the Oversight and Reform Committee, and it's sort of human nature, right? So what is the average lifespan of a senior political manager in the federal government? Well, the answer is about 18 months. So you got 18 months to make your mark on the federal agency you're heading or the division or department you're heading. A replacement of older IT, legacy systems or not, is going to be a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar proposition for most big federal agencies. And you need to decide as a manager, how much political capital are you willing to expend for something you're not even going to live to see politically? Your successor is going to do that. Secondly, you're tying up lots of personnel and lots of money for this big, kind of disruptive enterprise of replacing your existing IT systems. And almost inevitably, even if you were to agree to that de novo, something's going to come along to disrupt that, right? There's a proposal to cut your staff in half, and all of a sudden now you're turning your attention to how do I save our mission and how do I work with the existing workforce? And all of a sudden that IT priority you initially agreed to kind of falls in priority, and other things become more important. That is what happens. And that's why we created, and I know it anticipates a question you're probably going to ask, but that's one of the reasons we created the Technology Modernization Fund, to provide an economic catalyst and incentive for those managers to keep going with that proposition of replacing my older IT systems and take that risk, and we'll provide some financial incentives to help you do that.
Well, I'm going to pile on what Gerry just said, because he isn't just the father of that fund. He also dogmatically, unbelievably bit at the excesses in government when it came to server farms. These various facilities, he demanded a count. He then found out that no matter what count they gave, we kept finding more of them. And as Gerry pushed for consolidation to get efficiency, what he learned was exactly the kind of thing he just said, which is anyone with an 18-month or a 2-year horizon doesn't want to deal with the pain that takes 18 months to 2 years or beyond. But Congress is a permanent institution. And so when you have a long permanent institution in combination with empowering lower level people, it's well below the political class, if you will, in the executive branch, you're able to get buy-in. And so that's been part of what we're still doing, but it's part of what I've enjoyed working with Congressman Connolly for years on, is the fact that they began to realize that Congress wasn't going away, and that these things like FITARA weren't just a piece of legislation to be put on the shelf, but more needs to be done, particularly when it comes to direct access to the public. And I'll just give you a private sector example very quickly. When I started in the electronics business many years ago, I would go to a company out of Virginia called Circuit City, and the buyer would show me paper printouts of what the sales had been of my products by stores. And you would notice stores that performed well and stores that performed poorly. You tried to take notes, and then you tried to have your salesman follow up. Well, in the years that passed, companies like Walmart and Best Buy began giving companies like mine direct access to this data in real time. So if product wasn't selling at some store, we could send somebody in to find out. Maybe the product wasn't even on the shelf. Whatever the problem was, we could begin resolving them quicker. And those companies are around today. Well, Circuit City, sadly, has been gone for a while. But neither of those are where we are in the private sector today. Today, if you go to Target, they're going to tell you what product is in what store now and when you want to buy it. They've taken it all the way to the consumer being able to have direct access to know not just is it in stock, but what aisle it's on, so you can quickly find it. The private sector has leaped ahead of government. Government needs to learn from the private sector. That's a big part of what we're going to be teaching here in Congress to our contemporaries, is what is possible in the private sector can be implemented in many cases in the public sector if we're willing to make the investment and recognize that the consumer public, those 320 million Americans, are not being well served by government, even while they're well served by Amazon.
Representative Connolly, you actually mentioned the piece of legislation, the Modernizing Government Technology Act, or MGT Act, that you showed leadership through getting through. It's created the Technology Modernization Board and the Technology Modernization Fund. In addition to some of the other reasons that you mentioned earlier, can you tell me, why you were so passionate about this, and why both of you honestly were early supporters of this initiative?
So for a lot of our colleagues in Congress and for the public at large, if you're spending $96 billion a year in IT in the federal government, why do you need more money to incentivize people to replace the older IT systems they've got? And it was counterintuitive why you needed a fund to help catalyze that. And of course, what we had to educate people about was, well, there really isn't like $96 billion of new money. Most of that $96 billion a year is spoken for in the maintenance of older, clunky legacy systems. And so the capital available to actually reinvest and replace with newer, updated cybersecurity systems is actually pretty limited. And if someone's going to take that plunge, that big management risk to replace the whole IT system in their agency, you've got to have some incentive funds that give them a little bit of a cushion of risk coverage and just confidence to go forward. And so it took a little while to educate members of Congress, as I said, because it was counterintuitive why we needed to do that. But from a management point of view, we absolutely did. And I think there's a lot of excitement about the TMF now that we actually have some real money. But I'll add a political point. You know, Darrell and I and some other colleagues, most of whom are unfortunately now gone, were voices in the wilderness. There aren't a lot of members of Congress devoted to this subject, just aren't. And with respect to the TMF, you know, we were lucky to get a $25 million a year appropriation, which is simply, you know, spitting in the wind. I mean, that's not going to incentivize anybody. And so we were really glad to get $1 billion in the last legislative cycle for the TMF. Now that's real money, that's real investment, and that's going to make a difference in federal agencies in terms of making this transition. So making it work, really important, but understanding that that $96 billion a year figure is really misleading was also a key part of why I think we were enthusiastic about the TMF, but making sure that it had ample funding so that it had heft. It actually had critical mass for a lot of managers in the federal system.
Well, let's switch gears here. You know, we talked a little bit about federal IT systems, but, you know, as we saw during the pandemic, a lot of the problems that we saw were witnessed with state and local IT systems as well. What can the federal government do to help state and local governments modernize as well?
Well, I think there's where there's a great example of doing it wrong and then doing it better. Gerry and I might disagree in some ways about the history of the Affordable Care Act. One thing I think we all know is that when Obamacare's website came out, as it was known, it wasn't just a single failure at the federal level, it also failed in about half of the states. And today, the vast majority of the replacement sites all operate together with common software, common investment. Why? Well, because it never made sense, even though it happened, to give 50 states each money to develop separate websites with separate engines and separate decision processes, and then a 51st for the federal government. And yet that's what we did. Now, I'm going to try to be fair. This was a very tough piece of software to write. So the fact that it didn't work the first time shouldn't be the bellwether, but the fact that we tried to create 51 different systems and that there was no chief technology officer or chief information officer who was skilled and had the experience to shepherd that project is something that we held hearings on and we reformed. Today, a chief information officer does have real authority. They are not people who are just picked. There are people who have technical backgrounds and the predictable capability to know when to shut down a program or reprogram funds, or say we're in over our head and look for help. That's the future of successful IT, is getting the right people young in their career, keeping them for decades as they build expertise and success stories in ever bigger projects. And I think that's a big part of what the government oversight / government operations, what Gerry and I worked on together, that I think we're only halfway there, but we've made some progress there. The government is better at doing it today than it was just those years ago when the Affordable Care Act, stumbled at first.
I think that's really a powerful point, and maybe there are two takeaways from what Darrell just said. One is, with respect to the website rollout of the Affordable Care Act, there's this disconnect between mission and deployment with IT. So the people involved in creating the architecture, not legislatively, but programmatically, of the Affordable Care Act were all powerfully motivated people of substance. So the HHS secretary was a former governor, very committed to the mission. The direct implementer at CMS was a former nurse from Virginia, as a matter of fact, very committed to the substance of the mission. But neither of them had any IT background. In fact, neither of them saw the testing of the IT piece as integral to the mission. And that was a huge mistake that almost caused the collapse of the whole program. And so trying to create or develop a cadre of federal managers who understand that IT is not just a good thing to have or even a necessary evil. It is integral to that mission you're committed to, and you need to manage it that way, is really one of the great lessons I think hopefully we have learned from the examples Darrell gave and others. And I think that's really an important piece here.
Along those lines with states, the American Rescue Plan provided funds to state and local governments. As we've seen, many communities have yet to use these funds. Do you believe that the money allocated from the American Rescue Plan should be spent on modernizing state and local IT systems?
Let me kind of build on what I was just saying and what I think Darrell was saying before. If you believe in the mission, yes. What rhetorical question, what do you not get about the real patchwork system of unemployment all across the country? Remember that, unemployment is actually executed by 50 different states plus territories, right? So the federal government can legislate, and we did during the pandemic, who's eligible, and we broadened it. How long are people qualified for? We expanded it by 12 weeks. And what is there a federal minimum or a federal payment we want to add to the state unemployment weekly payment? And we did. We added $600 a week, and that later dropped to $400. Okay, so each of those 50 unemployment insurance systems had to program those changes into their IT systems. And on top of that, they in the first few months of the pandemic, as you recall, the economy was collapsing and unemployment skyrocketing. And they couldn't handle those programmatic changes and the volume of demand for people seeking unemployment. So that experience ought to tell us that investment is necessary at the state and local level in IT if we're going to make sure that the programmatic goals and policy goals Congress sets are met. And in the early stages of this pandemic, remember, one of the goals, and it was broadly accepted on a bipartisan basis, we had huge bipartisan votes for the first few COVID relief bills, but it was to inject capital into the economy immediately so that families were secure, people weren't being evicted, businesses weren't failing, and Wall Street didn't collapse. There was that sense of mission. But if you got IT systems that can't deliver on that sense of urgency, then the whole purpose you're about is damaged or severely impaired.
And piling on a little bit on what Gerry just said, when it comes to those residual funds, whatever pot of money they're in, certainly I would say that Congress needs to make sure the executive branch can allow for reprogramming of those funds into areas where it can be shown that that investment is going to prepare the state to do a better job in the future, prepare the state to be more efficient and effective, and nothing pays off as well as modernization of the customer-looking software and the back end, of course, that supports it. So the short answer to your question is yes, but I certainly think that those funds, which are sitting in all kinds of buckets of money, need to be justified on a case-by-case basis. And if they are, boy, I'll tell you, that would be the best investment we could make with those funds.
Yeah. Thank you, Congressman. State and local governments, adoption of technology can provide new and creative ways to provide services to constituents. Is there a single piece of technology that you believe will be helpful in transforming our communities?
Well, Gerry and I both have one thing in common, even though we're separated by nearly 3,000 miles, and that is traffic that no matter what is getting worse. So when we look at every one of the automobiles that's been produced for the last decade or more being a connected vehicle, they have communications on board, but government has not yet taken full advantage of tracking for purposes of light control, of congestion management, or even properly documenting for future construction. And so Congressman Connolly, as a former county commissioner, is acutely aware that if those decisions are made right, you limit congestion. If they're made wrong, you have gridlock. So I would say that creating smart cities and leveraging, if you will, the investment that the modern automobile companies from Tesla to Ford and the like have done would be one of the best investments, because very few cities have taken advantage, and actually no cities have fully taken advantage of that available communication. If you or I are driving down the road and we put on an app called Waze, we're going to enjoy some of the benefit of these cars communicating, but that's going to be us on an iPhone, not us communicating back to, if you will, the mothership that can make some very, very good decisions, including lane management, light management, and of course, future construction.
We're so invested in IT at the state and local level in the United States that it's a little hard to know where to begin to answer that question, because I would say an investment in almost any sector would have payoff. It's very important, and Darrell just hinted at this, to remember that the deliverer of services in the United States is at the local level, right? The federal government will set broad policy parameters and maybe rules of the order, but it's up to local or state, and usually local governments, to execute it. We don't provide unemployment insurance benefits; the states do. We don't, run food kitchens; localities do. We don't run schools; localities do. And so, invest in the technology that allows for ubiquitous broadband, which we are doing, in fact, in the infrastructure bill, but that's long overdue. Broadband is to the 21st century what rural electrification was to the 1930s during the Depression. Opens up universal opportunity, education-wise, employment-wise, socially, culturally, and on and on. So investing in technologies, to make us more efficient in the delivery of services and customer interaction that's user-friendly for customers, I think is just critical for our future. And any of those investments are going to have long-term returns that are definitely worth it.
Representative Connolly, I think you make a very good point about broadband and the need to consider connectivity as part of the secret sauce of making sure IT modernization works. Obviously, we're looking forward to working with you all and federal agencies as the broad infrastructure bill is implemented. Another thing today, I think it's really heartening to see that this is really a bipartisan issue, and it's one that is important to all Americans who rely on government. Representative Connolly, you were elected in 2008. Representative Issa, you were elected in 2000, and both of you have had an extensive track record of working together in a bipartisan manner. Do you remember where your working relationship started and how both of you continue to work at such a high level on a bipartisan manner today?
It might get a different answer from Gerry, but I think the one that I would have to give credit to is Gerry's predecessor and my former chairman, Tom Davis. He'd been a county commissioner. Gerry was. He knew of Congressman Connolly's work. He said, look, you need to meet this new member. I think you're going to like him. I think you're going to find that over time, you two are going to build a lot in common. He came to a committee I was already on, and it turned out to be dead right that what he had seen in the years after Congressman Davis had left the county made him very, very equipped to hit that committee and to become quite a leader on it. And so I'm going to give one man credit for putting us together, and then just a natural friendship that built from that.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you, Darrell. And I think, look, Darrell and I have been at times political adversaries. We don't always share the same philosophy or perspective about the role of government and broader public policy. But having said that, we were willing, and it turned out to be quite I think, a fruitful collaboration to work together on a lot of good government issues. And on the spectrum of good government issues, IT was something we had in common, both professionally in terms of our backgrounds and our interest here in Congress. And we realized it was an area we could target and do something about. It wasn't sexy. It didn't give you headlines. You weren't going to be, on cable news talking about FITARA and IT modernization. But everything we do in the private and public sector is dependent on that digital platform, on the internet, and on IT. And if we don't get that right, then the mission might as well be put in a closet somewhere, because it will be irrelevant. It won't work. And so I think both Darrell and I understood that and came to this subject with that kind of understanding, commitment, and passion. It's my hope, and I'm sure it's shared by Darrell, that we can get more and more colleagues involved in this subject matter, because it is so critical. And the one overlay, in addition to what we've focused on, of course, is the cyber security piece. That has loomed more and more important. It's the Achilles heel of democracies and of democratic institutions and government, government entities. And let me add one more point too, because I think both Darrell and I come from the private sector, for a lot of private sector experience, as well as my experience in the local government. And when we wrote the FITARA bill, among 24 federal agencies, there were 250 people with the title of CIO, Chief Information Officer. That meant you had a management system of no accountability. Nobody was in charge. Nobody was responsible. Nobody was ever at fault. It was this kind of management system. Darrell and I created a legislative process that includes an evolution to empower a CIO to basically have the authority to make decisions. That was a novel, revolutionary thought in the federal government, one that when you ask the private sector, how many CIOs do you get? They think it's a trick question. The answer is almost always one, no matter how large the corporation. But that's not true. So we had to deal with some management issues as well as technology issues to try to push the government in the right direction.
Because Gerry talked about cyber, I'm going to just chime in with one more thing, because it has not gotten enough attention. In Ukraine and other places where cyber has been used as a weapon, they almost always take down two areas: communication and power, meaning the grid goes down, and directly and indirectly, internet and other communications goes down. These are areas in which some of the oldest and most arcane software is being used. These are areas that are administered disproportionately by state and local governments or even the private sector, especially the power grid. And this is an area where Congress has put some attention. We're going to have to put a lot more into it. Some of it's money, some of it's just making sure that we eliminate the stovepipes that cause systems not to talk to each other or to be vulnerable to being talked to by an adversary. And so, as we're looking at IT modernization, it won't all be government directly. Some of it's going to be very indirect, but it's going to be just as important so that the next pandemic isn't a pandemic caused by the hospital shutting down because the grid shut down.
No, that's an excellent point. And I think that this has been a call that both private sector and the public sector need to embrace digital transformation on multiple levels. Representative Issa, Representative Connolly, we thank you today for your leadership and for joining us. And we look forward to partnering with you to make the IT Modernization Caucus a success.
Thank you.
So, once again, I appreciate it again, and thank you. And once again, I'll thank you for joining us today. This is Jordan Crenshaw again, and I look forward to meeting with you all soon for our next Tech Talk. Thanks again.